Good morning. It's an absolute pleasure for me to present the extended half-life clotting factor data from adolescents and adults. And it's a very hard act to follow when Guy has done a presentation before you. I don't have any jokes. I've just got hard facts, and I hope that, in fact, you'll follow the facts as I enjoyed putting them together. That's my talk outline. I'll again, and perhaps at risk of repetition, give an overview of the half-life extension technologies. I'll summarize the pharmacokinetics and efficacy and safety data for the factor 9 and the factor 8 in adults and pediatric and adolescents. And in the last two sections of the talk, I would want to be a little bit provocative and ask, how can we use the extended half-life products in real life, and this is just to allow a discussion later, and what are the potential impacts of extended half-life products in our clinical settings. Just to remind everyone that the current standard of care in hemophilia is prophylaxis, which is infusion on a regular basis of the clotting factor to prevent bleeding episodes. However, there are barriers, many barriers to prophylaxis, and they include the need to inject the clotting factor concentrate at least 2 to 3 times a week, poor venous access, which Guy has alluded to, and of course, poor adherence and compliance by our patients. So essentially, the extended half-life products were developed to mitigate against these limitations, preventing the implementation of prophylaxis. In the endeavor to extend half-life, in the context of hemophilia, there were two approaches that have been employed, the fusion technology approach and the PEGylation approach. The fusion technology approach has 3 ways of doing it. It's the FC fusion, and I'll go into some detail into that, the albumin fusion, and more lately the CTP fusion, which I will not talk much about. And the products that have been used with all 3 of these approaches in fusion technology include the factor 8, the factor 9, and the factor 7. And because data has not yet been published, at least clinical data in the context of factor 7, I will not talk about that. What about the PEGylation approach? There are 3 approaches. This is site-directed PEGylation, random PEGylation, and oat-glyco-PEGylation. These have been employed in all of the studies that I'll be presenting with the Bayer 94 using site-directed PEGylation, the Baxter 855 using random PEGylation, and the Novo Nordisk N8 and N9 GPs using the glycopegylation. How does it really work in life? The fusion technology, it's covalent bonding of the Fc portion of the immunoglobulin to one of the domains of the heavy chain of the immunoglobulin. And it's a straightforward procedure that actually results in a hemostatically active protein called a factor 8 or factor 9 Fc. The same similar approach in the case of albumin fusion. The innovation here is the use of recombinant albumin, a 585 amino acid chain of protein that is linked to a protein, and the fused combined protein is hemostatically active, as you'll see in the studies that I'm going to present. So how do these proteins work? In the case of PEGylation, you can see that the PEG molecule in the Bayer 94 is attached to a specific mutated site in the clotting factor protein. In the case of the Baxter 855, it's a random assignment or attachment of the PEG molecule. It could be in any one of the domains, whether it's in the heavy chain or the light chain of the clotting factor, factor 8 or factor 9. And lastly, in the case of glycopegylation, the PEG molecule is specifically attached to the sugar moiety of the protein. Mechanism of action of PEGylation, this is a subject of extensive speculation, but I think in this audience we are in reasonable agreement that at least 3 of these would be applicable. There is decreased glomerular filtration of the protein as a result of increased hydrodynamic volume when the protein has a PEG molecule attached to it. There is receptor-mediated clearance of the protein that is reduced as a result of the attachment of the PEG moiety. And of course, there is decreased proteolytic degradation of the proteins. Most of these are subject of extensive basic science investigations, but I think it does work. And in fact, it's reasonable to say that at least one or more of these mechanisms probably are responsible for half-life extension in the products that I'm going to present. The mechanism of half-life extension in the fusion proteins for both the FC fusion and the albumin are the same. They are taking advantage of the natural neonatal FC receptor recycling in the body, which is illustrated in this cartoon from the NEJM. So what are some of the unique characteristics, pharmacokinetic, efficacy, and safety of the extended half-life factor VIII proteins? In this cartoon, I tried to put in one slide, and I know it's a very busy slide. It's not meant for you to read, just to illustrate that all 4 proteins actually differentiates themselves from the standard half-life clotting factor VIII that we are used to. Clearly, there is a difference in the pharmacokinetics. And I've summarized some of the pharmacokinetics in the next few slides, starting with the slides that shows the half-life properties of the extended half-life recombinant factor VIII. As you can see, fairly limited number of patients. We're talking here just over 600 patients in the 4 studies. You can see that the half-life range is very variable, from about 11.6 in N8GP to about 28.1 in the Bayer product. So fairly wide half-life, and if one summarizes this in the context of the median half-life, you can see that the range is still wide, with the Bex 855 mean of 14.3, the Bayer one 18.7, and the factor VIII FC and the N8GP having 19 hours each respectively. So essentially, we're looking at an increase in half-life over the standard half-life product of 1.4 for 2 of the products, 1.5 and 1.6, which is, in the big scheme of things, as you'll see in the recombinant factor IX product, is actually a minimal increase. And the reasons for that, I think, are obvious to this audience, that there is a requirement for factor VIII to be bound to van Willebrand's, and none of these proteins which are recombinant have actually got van Willebrand's in them. So what about the efficacy of the extended half-life recombinant factor VIII product? I've actually put them in this table for ease of reference. And in summary, actually, if you give 1 injection for the treatment of bleeds, you get a remarkable response of over 80% across all products. If you give 2 injections, you push that response to over 95%, in fact, across all of the products. The median annualized bleeding rate across all 4 products was an impressive 2 to 4 on average. Just bearing in mind that there's variability in the dosing frequency. Notably, the Bayer product was dosed, you can see, in fact, the Baxter product was dosed twice a week, whereas the rest of the products were actually dosed once a week. So on average, we're looking at the annualized bleeding rate of 2 to 4 for the extended half-life products, the 4 extended half-life products that have been published. So what about efficacy and safety in the perisurgical setting? And I'll expand on this in the factor IX product. Some of this data obviously has not been published, but we know that the studies have been performed. There's only one study whose data has been published, and that is the recombinant factor IX FC. You can see that overall hemostatic efficacy is 100%, where 12 major surgeries and 27 minor surgeries were performed. And there were no safety concerns in terms of deaths, thrombosis in this particular study. And I have no reason to believe that, in fact, the other 3 products will be different from this. If one looks at the safety of the rest of the extended half-life products, you can see that, in fact, there's a large number of adverse events that were recorded, which is not unexpected in any clinical trial. The number of patients that were seen in the various studies are indicated. You can see that, in fact, there were no inhibitors across all 4 products. There were not deaths or thrombosis in these 4 products. There were a few patients that developed anti-drug antibodies. These are non-neutralizing antibodies, and safe to say that, in fact, none of the patients that developed non-neutralizing antibodies were taken off the study because that did not impact on the clinical efficacy of the product in the various patients. There were a few patients that developed drug-related adverse events. These have nothing to do probably with the drug per se in terms of anaphylaxis and allergy. These are purely the impression of the investigator saying that it's most likely due to the drug. But I mean, this is not an indication of a safety concern from our perspective. So if one jumps on to the factor IX products, what do we have? I've listed the published data on the 3 studies that have been published to date, the 9FC, 9FP, and the N9GP. You can see that the decay curves are almost similar, and some are obviously more impressive than others. And you'll notice that, in fact, I'm purposely not pointing out the trough levels, etc. In this audience, it is quite clear that, in fact, that is subject to huge revision. What was initially thought to be an adequate trough level of 3% probably will not be the case after this meeting. I've no doubt in my mind. You'll see that, in fact, the various products are differentiating themselves significantly from the standard half-life products. So if one looks at the half-life properties specifically for the 3 products, you can see that, in fact, for those patients, we're talking about fairly extended half-life of 82 hours in 9FC, 102 hours in 9FP, and 96 hours in N9GP, with a mean half-life of the standard product indicated in that column, giving a ratio which is quite acceptable of 2.4, 4.2, and 4.8 for the 3 products respectively. Much, much higher than the ratio that we saw in the case of factor VIII, and largely because factor IX does not need van Willebrand to be able to stay in circulation. Some of the more impressive pharmacokinetic properties of the extended half-life recombinant factor IX product, and I've indicated in the red box the standard half-life recombinant factor IX, you can see that there's clearly a significant increase in the area under the curve, a significant decrease in clearance, and a significant increase in incremental recovery of the 3 extended half-life products relative to the standard half-life product. If one uses the extended half-life recombinant factor IX in prophylaxis in adolescents and adults, the results are equally impressive. If you give a dose, in the case of factor IX, each of the studies chose to give more than 1 dose. As indicated there, factor IX FC used a dose of 50 and 100 IU per kg. Factor IX FP used 40 and 75, and N9GP used 10 and 40. And the frequency is as indicated. For the lower dose across the 3 products, the frequency was at 7-day intervals. For the higher dose for factor IX FC, it was every 10 days. For the 9FP, it was every 14 days. And for the N9GP, it was every 7 days. And you can see that in the context of prophylaxis, the annualized bleeding rates, the annualized bleeding rates were actually reasonably low relative to the patients who were treated episodically. And in fact, later on when the critique comes through for these 2 presentations, one of the criticism is that we're comparing apples to oranges here. Now, each one of these studies started off with a baseline of comparing episodic treatment to prophylaxis, which is probably not appropriate, but that's all that we had at the time. What is remarkable about the annualized bleeding rates in the case of extended half-life factor 9 is that, in fact, you can see that the range is wide. The interquartile range is wide, ranging from 0 in the case of 9FP to up to 6 in N9GP, but nevertheless the average is anywhere between 1 and 3. If one looks at efficacy in the treatment of bleeds as opposed to prophylaxis in adults and adolescents, you can see the doses that were used, 50, 50, and 40 IU per kg for the 3 products. When 1 or 2 injections were given, overall, the hemostatic efficacy was really impressive, 97% across the board, almost the same in all of these products in the context of the published pivotal studies. If one looks at the safety of the extended half-life factor 9 product, there were no death or thromboembolism. As you know, we're giving fairly hemostatic agents here that have the potential to give thrombosis. There were no drug-related adverse events. And in fact, in the context of the extended half-life factor 9, there were a few patients that developed anti-drug antibodies, non-neutralizing antibodies that had no interference with hemostatic activity of the drugs. And in fact, none of these patients in both the factor 9 FC and the N9GP had to be taken out of study as a result of the development of the non-neutralizing antibodies. There were quite a few drug-related serious adverse events, and perhaps to point out here that none of those were directly related to the factor 9, as in anaphylaxis or allergy, for example. This is the impression of the investigator thinking that the adverse event was related to the drug. Thank you. What I would like us to explore, and perhaps even further in the discussion, is how can we use the extended half-life products in real life? You'll appreciate that, in fact, across all the studies, the extended half-life factor 8 and factor 9, a wide range of regimens were used. And I tried to summarize all of those regimens into this one slide. In the first instance, the variables will be the dose and the dosing frequency and the trough level against whether you are giving those in a fixed or adjusted fashion. So the first approach would be, and if you choose to, is to adjust your dose whilst you fix your dosing frequency and the trough level that you want to achieve. Next. The next approach in the dosing regimen would be to adjust your dosing frequency whilst you fix your dose and your trough level. Next. And the third approach would be to adjust your trough level, and this is a subject of huge debate in this meeting, and I'm sure in all the subsequent hemostasis meeting, whilst you fix the dose and the dosing frequency. And the last approach probably applies to patients that are in steady state, out of harm, probably not hemostatically challenged, where you have a fixed dose, a dosing frequency, and a trough level in someone who doesn't really need attention from the treater's perspective. So I try to summarize the various dosing regimen without necessarily having to go into each one of those. This is more or less how one would approach the use of both the extended half-life factor 8 and the factor 9 in real life. Next slide, please. So the next question that I would like to pose is there a difference when one does the subgroup analysis across the various studies? In other words, if one is looking at factor 8 or factor 9, in the case of adults versus pediatric, in the case of spontaneous bleeds versus traumatic bleeds, in the case of joint versus non-joint bleeds, and in the case of major surgery versus minor surgery, can one then make a case for a differential approach in the various scenarios? If one looks first of all at safety, you can see that in fact if you try and scan through all of the studies, there's actually no difference across the subgroups. If one looks at efficacy, the same. There is no difference. And if one looks at the pharmacokinetics, bearing in mind that the pediatric pharmacokinetics is slightly different from the adult pharmacokinetics, but in practical terms, there's actually no difference if that expectation is taken into account. And finally, and I think that is actually the essence of the extended half-life product, is there a difference in the infusion frequency that one would choose one extended half-life product over another? And in fact, there is actually no difference amongst the various subgroups of patients that were looked at in the various extended half-life products. Next. And finally, and probably the only reason all of us are here is we just want to know if this is not just academic exercise and commercial exercise. Does it have an impact in the way we care for patients? And I must admit, these studies are fairly new. The impact needs time, and most of these have not really come to the fore in the form of published studies. But I can share some of the snippets of some of the impacts these products will have in the way we practice the care of people with hemophilia. Next slide, please. So when one takes the standard of care, which is the standard half-life clotting factor concentrate, you are almost invariably facing poor compliance, adherence issue, increased bleeding frequency, as well as musculoskeletal disease burden, and of course decreased quality of life. Those are the realities that one is facing. In the context of extended half-life products, you can see that it potentially, next slide, you are going to improve the compliance and the adherence of the the regimens that is prescribed for the patients, and this is a no-brainer. And in fact, the fact that we don't have any evidence published to date, I'm not worried about it. What evidence is published today and is beginning to accumulate is to indicate reduced bleeding frequency, and in some instances zero bleeding in some of the patients, reduced musculoskeletal disease, and I'll show you some of that, and of course improved quality of life when one is using extended half-life products as compared to the standard half-life product. Next. So when one is looking at the reduced bleeding frequency, there is some data already, next slide, that suggests that in fact there may well be an impact in the way we're going to look after patients. If you compare the factor VIII products, all three products reported on patients having zero bleeds. In the case of the BEX 855, up to 40% of the patients had no bleeds in the study. The N8GP had 37% of the patients. The recombinant 8FC had a number of regimens, all of which reported patients with zero bleeds, the highest being in the individualized prophylaxis of almost 40%. Next. What is remarkable, and I'm not talking about pediatric here, but it's just to compare the adults to pediatric, you can see in fact the gain in pediatric is significantly higher, up to 50% in the pediatric patients treated with a modified prophylaxis, and up to 60% in the pediatric patients treated with individual prophylaxis had zero bleeds. And that's actually the kind of impact that one is looking for, and there is opportunity for us to actually improve on that zero bleed rate. Next slide. What about the extended half-life recombinant factor IX achieving zero bleed? It can be shown in this slide that all three products have reported zero bleeds, starting from 23% in arm 1 of the 9FC, and a remarkable 70% in the target joints in the 9FP. Nevertheless, a range of patients showing zero bleeds across the board. Next slide. Is there any impact on reducing the musculoskeletal disease burden? After all, one of the unmet needs in hemophilia is the burden of musculoskeletal disease. One could summarize this by saying that by having zero bleeds in at least a percentage of our patients, one could look forward to having no arthropathy in some patients, and consequently reduce disease burden in terms of the mortality and the morbidity that is associated with our patients. And in fact, the data, some of the data, early data that is going to be published, is going to be presented in this Congress by Johannes Oldenburg in the next day or two, in fact tomorrow, in a session where there's clearly an indication that some of the extended half-life products, at least factor VIII FC, has an impact on musculoskeletal disease. And I would ask you to actually not miss that session. Next slide. Finally, we do want to improve the quality of life of our patients, something that often is very difficult to measure. There's actually some data now that indicates that some of the extended half-life products do have an impact on quality of life. A study by Kathleen Waywick, in fact it was published 2 weeks ago, if you missed it, in Hemophilia, is examining exactly that in the context of the A-long and the B-long study, which were the pivotal studies in VIII FC. In fact, I won't go into the details except to say that clearly the indications are that the extended half-life factor VIII product at least has an impact in improving the quality of life of the patients. And I have no doubt in my mind that similar studies are going to be conducted in the other factor VIII and the factor IX products that I have presented to you. Next slide. So in summary, I've presented to you data from the clinical studies in adolescents and adults which suggest that the extended half-life clotting factor concentrates are indeed efficacious and they show improved pharmacokinetic properties, and there is no safety signals in the context of the adolescents and adults. And in fact, you gather from the pediatric studies that have been published, we are not seeing any safety signals. We also can be assured in the adult and the adolescent patient population that the extended half-life clotting factor concentrate, they show efficacy and safety in a variety of clinical settings, including their use in prophylaxis, in the treatment of bleeds, and also in the peri-surgical hemostasis. And we'll hear more about the use in the various settings in the near future when those studies are published. And finally, we should bear in mind that, in fact, our experience in the use of this product outside the clinical trial is currently very limited, but nevertheless rapidly expanding. And most of us are very positive that the extended half-life, whether we're talking about the factor VIII or factor IX, will have a positive impact in the management of the people with hemophilia. Thank you very much for your attention.